DB&I just finished. ODC just started. And now PoppyCon, DipCon, DixieCon. Oh my. I'm David Hood of the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Dateline, March 2022. For our feature story, the diplomacy hobby has always had its content creators. During the postal hobby's age of zines, we had writers and editors producing copious amounts of diplomacy articles, hobby news, political debate, movie reviews, and all sorts of visual content in the written medium and technical tools that were available back in those days. Later in the program, we'll interview a veteran diplomat to talk about the hobby structure of the 1970s and 80s. And then we'll bring the story of diplomacy content creation to the present by presenting a panel discussion about diplomacy now shown in the newest media, featuring 3 producers of diplomacy-themed videos on YouTube. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. Diplomacy's Big Dance, the DBN Invitational Virtual Tournament, finished with a bang as this season's Super 7 competed on February 26th to crown the 2021 Diplomat of the Year. Santa Monica, California resident Jason Mastbaum came out on top as Russia, besting a field consisting of Katie Gray in France, Brandon Fogel as England, the Turkey of Ed Sullivan, Saren Kwok as Austria, Farron Jane in Italy, and the Germany of Nicolas Taillet. Let's hear from the guy who just took the second Caliber Cup as DB&I winner, the Mastbaum himself. Look, folks, I've got Jason Mastbaum here, the Diplomat of the Year for 2021, having just won the 2022 DB&I season. Welcome to Deadline again, Jason.
Thanks, David. How are you doing?
Good, good. Tell us how the tournament went for you in general, and then we'll talk about the top board in just a minute.
So as everybody got to see, the first round went great. And then the second round started having visions of like, oh my God, am I going to get like knocked down to 8th place by 1 point again? But, for the qualifiers, it obviously worked out better than that. And then, needless to say, no complaints about how the following weekend went.
Well, how did you win the thing? Let's just cut to the chase. How did you win this thing?
So, as I think I spoke about a little bit right afterward when they brought me on. So, there was a lot of shifting attempts, trying to get people to go after each other. It was convenient at various points early on to try to take me out. I had visions of a early, go take an evening walk before the sun sets. But end of the day, just, top board is different, of course, than the normal board, because you can't just say, okay, like, let's all take our big shared top and go, and then we all get a good score and go into the next round, right? Somebody has to win. And after I survived those initial attempts at taking me out, it just became, everybody else was more annoyed with each other than they were at me. So I just sat back and encouraged the people near me to keep being annoyed at the people on the other side of the board. And, eventually I hungered down long enough, like that played out long enough. And, everybody was okay with, like, Saren and Nicola were okay with me winning.
Have you arrived now as a top tier player? You've been in the hobby a long time. This is quite a feather in your cap. Do you feel like you've arrived?
I'm supposed to say no, right? So that people don't like put a target on my back at tournaments going forward.
You could meta game this any way you want, but I'm asking a legitimate question. Do you feel like you've arrived?
It was definitely very gratifying after how long I've been playing to win an event like this.
That's a fair answer.
Yeah.
Final question is, what do you think the DBN Invitational means to the hobby in general?
So, as I said during the interview, before the qualifying rounds, course, there used to be like invitationals in the past, like the ones like Chris Martin used to have in the 2010s. Now this version of it, I think, gives everybody something to play for all year, right? Because you show up and you want to do well at any tournament, of course. But I got my auto qualifier out of the way. I think Whipping last year was the first tournament of the DBNI season, right? Yeah. So I could have just stopped playing, and I could have still showed up and played, at the DBNI. But like it gave me incentive to keep playing, try to move my score up, keep my score up, so that I could have a good seed once we got to the DBNI. And I think it really adds that element of like you're playing for something all year and not just one-off events.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with savoring a one-off tournament victory or a one-off tournament good result.
Of course,
there are people that's fine, and that's should be fine for them. But it seems like go ahead.
I'm not saying that the all year element's better. It's just it's something different than what we've had in the past.
It's gravy on top, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Jason, thanks for being on the show as always, and congratulations on a really impressive achievement.
Thanks, David.
The 2022 Online Diplomacy Championship is currently taking entrance on the Play Diplomacy platform. Malarkey, publisher of Notes on a Napkin and a prolific diplomacy writer, serves as tournament director for the event, which expects to begin play during the first weekend of April. There will be 4 qualifying rounds and then a 5th one called the Medal Round, which will include a top board for the top 7, as well as games for others trying to improve their overall tournament placement. Malarkey is using the DC scoring system, which has draw-based points plus bonus points awarded through a sum of squares type mechanic. To sign up for this co-equal World Championship of Diplomacy, which is co-equal with the Virtual Diplomacy Championships and World DipCon, follow the link below to the ODC forum topic at playdiplomacy.com. In 2021, the first face-to-face tournament held anywhere in the world since COVID was actually down under in Melbourne, Australia, at the home of longtime diplomacy hobbyist Melissa Call, called PoppyCon. The Diplomacy Association of Australia and New Zealand, the DAANZ, has announced the 2022 edition will be held April 23rd and 24th, with 2 games to be held that Saturday and 1 on Sunday. You'll be able to match wits with the last 2 PoppyCon winners, Peter McNamara and Jamal Blakarli, and meet in person Amby and Kaner from the Diplomacy Games podcast. All that and 3-time world champion Andrew Goff, too. A link to contact information about this event can be found below. Ever wonder how diplomacy is explained to non-dippers by other non-dippers trying to encapsulate the experience of playing the game? Wonder no more. The fine folks at TV Tropes, which is the all-devouring pop culture wiki, start off with a bang on their page devoted to diplomacy by including the following intro, and I quote, "I got my buddy. I trust him with my car, my computer, and my rent. I will not trust that son of a bitch with Belgium, though." And then the explanation continues later in the same paragraph to say, and I quote, "Possibly the most intense board game experience ever created. It has incredibly simple rules, is still popular more than 50 years after its publication, and will break your tiny little mind." You know what? I think they got it just about right. A link to this highly entertaining and yet awfully accurate portrayal is below in the description field. Now, let's take a trip around the various websites and YouTube channels for the content providers we call our DBN media partners. You will see Florida Man himself later during this episode's panel discussion, but you'll also want to know that his channel on YouTube now includes a recent video describing the Sea Lion opening, which is used by the FG Alliance against England. Brother Board's Diplomacy Dojo podcast series just released a new episode featuring 2016 World DipCon champ Chris Brand of British Columbia. And it's adapted from an edition of Masterclass that he did live on the VWDC Discord server. The topic, how and when to rally the rest of the board to stop a solo push. Speaking of podcasts, our friends from down under, Amby and Kaner, from a Brisbane, Queensland area, then hunkering down for storms, also just dropped a new episode of their Diplomacy Games podcast. They focused on their plans to attend PoppyCon, the covering of the many online variant games they're each playing, and they also had discussion about Ukraine. By the way, we'll have a special variant focus in next month's Deadline News featuring Amby or Kaner on the panel, so watch out for that. You can find links to these diplomacy content providers as well as others at the North American Diplomacy Federation website, thenadf.org. In a past edition of Deadline, I reported on the creation of a new online diplomacy zine called Notes on a Napkin. I've already mentioned publisher Malarkey. He is now soliciting articles for the second edition of his online zine, which is scheduled to be released by his Diplomaticon publishing venture sometime in the next several weeks. If the diplomacy writing bug has bitten you, a link to Notes on a Napkin is below. You can check out issue 1 and then contact Malarkey with any submissions you might have for his issue 2. While you're at it, issue 157 of the hobby's flagship publication Diplomacy World is also coming up soon, with April 1 as the expected release date. DW editor Doug Kent would also welcome your submissions for that zine. So his contact information is available below, as well as the contact information for Malarkey. Season 3 of the Virtual Diplomacy League just began play on March 12th, with all that play-by-play action having been covered on the League Night program right here at the Diplomacy Broadcast Network. In the first 3 2022 season games, we saw Wesley Ketchum nab a nifty 10-center board top as Turkey. We saw John Anderson dominate his game as a 13-center Italian. And we saw Steve Hoag's 9 centers edge 2 other players at 8 centers in the nightcap game. Sign up now for the second game day of the VDL, scheduled for April the 2nd, by going to the VWDC Discord server and looking for the VDL role. Now, all of this talk of the VDL should wet your whistle for the start of this year's Tour of Britain, which is another virtual face-to-face diplomacy league, and it begins play on Sunday, March 27th, with a launch at 4 p.m. GMT, which is 11 a.m. Eastern Time. For more information on how you can join that year-long quest for the British crown, you can contact Tournament Director Gary Sturley on Discord or visit the Tour of Britain space on the VWDC Discord server. The 2022 DipCon, the North American Diplomacy Championships for face-to-face play, will be held at the Whipping Tournament put on by the Bay Area Diplomacy Club in San Jose, April 29th through May 1st. Everyone who is anyone and can actually make it, fine, will be there in force, and yours truly will also be reporting on the gaming action live from the tournament floor. Sure, you can catch that live stream Sunday on DBN, but why not go to the event your own self? NADF President Siobhan Nolan and reigning DipCon champion Adam Silverman will be hosting this event as usual, and they'd love to see you. An invite link to the VWDC Discord server is below, since much information about the event can be found in the whipping space on that server. A link to the registration form is also provided below in the show notes. So join us in San Jose, California, and then make plans to attend the 36th annual DixieCon Diplomacy Tournament the last weekend in May in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. More information about that event is available at www.dixiecon.com. And now it's time for a segment we call My Favorite Things. We'll interview a diplomacy player about that person's diplomacy journey, and then we'll talk about something of particular interest to that hobbyist, whether or not related to diplomacy. This month, we talked to longtime diplomacy fan Ken Peel of Maryland about what it was like to be in the diplomacy hobby before the dawn of the internet, and just about what diplomacy players can find so appealing. Well, hello, Ken Peel, and welcome to Deadline here on DBN.
Oh my, we're up on a deadline, huh?
We're on a deadline.
Mhm.
It is not the deadline. Well, actually, maybe we are the deadline since we've been going for about a year and a half now. You can have a long and meaningful connection to the game of diplomacy as well as to the hobby surrounding it. So
Mhm.
you could first tell us how you got into the game and the hobby.
Well, I've probably gotten a game in the hobby in kind of a similar way you did, and that is in high school. We had a very active gaming group. You know, we started off playing Risk and other games, and then we discovered uh, diplomacy. I think it was back in the one was the old before Avalon Hill bought it out, and so we played that, and that then became our game. And Mark Stegeman, who I know is a friend of yours and a former professor, um, was a part of that group. And then when we graduated from high school, we all went off to different colleges, and we decided we wanted to try to stay in touch with each other. So we started playing the game by mail, and that was just us. We didn't know anyone else was doing that. We didn't know there was any kind of organized, or should I say, disorganized hobby. And so we did that for I think a couple of games, and then of our group, I was the one who stumbled across the more organized diplomacy hobby, and I don't remember exactly how I did it. I think I think it happened. I think I was at a local game store, and I think I saw a flyer up that Ed Roble had put up. Ed Roble was really the man behind the local Washington diplomacy gaming group that existed at that time, called the Warthog, for the Washington area retinue of tacitly highly organized gamesters. Was the whimsical name that we gave ourselves. And he ran a zine called Politesse. And the reason, and it was a face-to-face zine in what then was in the zine world was pretty much a postal zine world. And he thought he was more of a face-to-face player than a postal player, and he thought, but he saw that there was more interesting fandom around the postal world, and he thought, what was the difference? And he figured, well, because the postal players have this way of communicating with each other and creating, and writing and creating. In the end, I think he wasn't actually quite right, although he had a certain amount. But I think that's how I got into it. And then from Robo, he knew about the larger world, and I started discovering the other ones. Of our high school group, the only ones who followed us into that is Mark Stegeman and Doug Brown. I don't know that he ever really played diplomacy by mail, but I know that he does he got in touch, he connected with Bruce Lindsay, and I think the sports team, the fantasy football and stuff, he's been doing that for years and years with Bruce Lindsay. Who was one of the other big postal names at the time, and half of the moving force behind what was then the great feud between him and Kathy Byrne.
Yeah, we're not. Our viewers have heard a little bit about the great feud, but I have not given it a great deal of discussion.
There's no, because there was no real substance to it. It was all personalities, and
right.
And they were saying awful things about each other. It really got quite bad until it finally petered out.
Well, let's step back. Let's step back for our viewers just a minute so they can figure out who Ken Peel is. I think diplomatic skills would have been particularly handy in your real life career. So could you tell our viewers a little bit about that and whether you agree with that?
Sure. I was never really all that great a diplomacy player. I'm still not a great diplomacy player, but I enjoyed it because it is the most social of all games I've ever run across. And it is a socializing in the gaming world that I like the most. And it also provided an outlet writing and for and fanish stuff, and I really enjoyed that. What was your question about?
Your career had.
Oh, my
I think
career.
your career is relevant to this.
Probably
Let's hear about it.
of all of the people in the sort of the diplomacy world, I guess I ended up having much more of a foreign policy career than any others. I remember Mike Mazer, who's still a good friend of mine, who ran a Dipsine Strange Doings at the time, said that when he got into it, he thought that probably a lot of them were like that. And actually, a lot of U.S. diplomats play diplomacy. The reason why that picture behind me, that is an sort of a colored engraving that I bought at a street vendor in Budapest. And I remember I was on one of many. Back shortly to my career, then back to the picture. I spent my career. I'm retired now. Retired a few years ago. I spent a good time working as a staffer in the House of Representatives for a congresswoman who served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Olympia Snow, and then in the Senate, I was a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then after that, after the year 2000, I went into the administration, and I first was at the State Department policy planning staff, and then I went over to National Security Council, and then I went over to the Treasury Department, worked in their international bureau, and then I finished off my career as a posting in London as the U.S. board member of European Development Bank that was working with countries of Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union to try to create their economies. And back to the fact that actually diplomats do play diplomacy. I used to travel quite a bit, and I've visited many embassies in my business trips. And I remember one of them I was in the embassy in Budapest, and I saw a diplomacy board set up. And I thought, well, this is the mid game, and I was looking. Russia was doing quite well, and so then after I came back from that staff trip, I thought, I think probably no one's ever tried to run a postal game of U.S. diplomats, and obviously they are out there playing it. I'd seen the game several other places too when I was out there, and so I sent flyers to the community liaison officers of all U.S. embassies, and I said, please post it. Here's a game for any diplomacy players. I'm gonna, I'll run it, and so I ran a zine called Diplomatic Contraband for maybe a year. In the end, the game ended up being orphaned because we could only move once every 2 months because of international mail, and it just kind of petered out. But it was interesting for a while because the game actually was diplomatic contraband, because we were using the diplomatic pouch mail service in order to communicate and to send out the zines, and under international diplomatic arrangements, that's only supposed to be used for official communication. Now, of course, diplomats use it for other things as well. But
I don't see why you don't understand that this was official. A diplomacy game among diplomats sounds pretty official to me.
It was pretty interesting doing that. But yeah, so U.S. diplomats play it, but you don't see them much. I think because of their careers, they're always moving every few years. It's like a military career, and it's. Although now in the world that everything's on the internet, I would think that maybe you might run into more of them.
Yeah, there probably is happening there. Mm-hmm. Ken, I first got to know you for real when you were part of a committee that helped bring the second ever World Championships, the World DipCon, to my tournament, DixieCon, in 1990. You mentioned your high school buddy, Mark Stegman. He was my faculty advisor at Chapel Hill, helped me start DixieCon, and actually he won it a couple of times. But in preparation for this interview, I ran across an article that Rex Martin had run
Yes.
in the Avalon Hill Game Company's magazine, The General, back in the day. And it actually promotes the World DipCon by saying Ken Peel and David Hood are the primary movers in bringing World DipCon to our shores. What do you remember about that thing? That was literally 32 years ago.
Well, I don't know that I really was a shaker mover. I think maybe Rex Martin knew who I was because I was one of those who was agitating with Avalon Hill to try to get more flyers into the diplomacy boxes to get people more interested in the postal game. I was never that much of a publisher. As I said before, I ran Diplomatic Contraband for a year or so. I took over Politesse from Ed Roble for a year or so. I edited and distributed a beginner's guide called Masters of Deceit.
Yep.
Around that time too. I was quite active in the 80s, and I loved the game. It's funny. I love diplomacy players, and I love the game, but I also hate the game. I think probably a lot of diplomacy players feel that way because it's the only game I think that I've ever come across. You can only win by cooperating with other players on the board. I mean, you can only win by cooperating with others.
You got to cooperate.
You can also only win if you're going for a win by ultimately betraying everybody on the board.
Yeah, and it takes both skills, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the betrayal aspect of it that I was really never very good at, and I always feel terrible when I was betrayed, or when I felt that I needed to betray somebody else.
Well, let's talk about the way you said you're really active in the 80s. That's when I started to become active in the hobby, and it really was the fanishness of it really was fun. The zine-based fanishness of the diplomacy hobby. For those that don't really, I mean, we still have a few zines now that are published online, but it's nothing like it was back in the day. Give us a flavor of what that was like to have a diplomacy hobby that was based on these postal zines.
Well, there's two. Again, I don't know the hobby all that well right now, but there were two aspects to the play of diplomacy as a hobby. There was a face-to-face world, which is actually, I think, quite strong right now, stronger than it was back then. And you had some very strong players. One of them still is active, Eddie Berson.
Oh, yes.
One of the very early and strongest face-to-face players. He's now mayor of Concord, California. And then there's the poster world. The poster world was sort of really came to fruition. This was before my time, but I was told about in the 1960s, when the postal play of diplomacy was discovered by science fiction fans, because there was, and I assume there still is, a very active science fiction hobby, and they ran their own, they published their own amateur magazines. And, those are people like Rod Walker and Conrad von Metzke, who's still around, but although his health is really deteriorating, sadly.
Yes.
Larry Perry, who, again, sadly took his own life just a few years ago. Right. But I think probably because his health was very bad. Yeah. But I think of the original crowd, Eddie Berson, I think, is really the only one that I can think of who's still around. And and then John Boardman, of course, who published the first zine. But the reason I bring in the science fiction crowd is because they brought with it a sort of a fanishness and an approach of sort of whimsy that really characterized the postal world. The postal zines would run games, and you would take just one move a month. Sometimes with some zines, maybe a little bit faster than that, but it was difficult to do it faster than that because it was before the time of even email, much less the internet. And so the games are run, but the focus of the magazines, there would be commentary by the publisher. the everybody who was in the game would write commentary about the game, and sort of they were called news releases or press releases, whatever they were called, and it was just a lot of fun, and you would have so that was the world of the postal writing, and house cons. People would get together. Like I would go up to Philadelphia for Steve Arnowoodian, who was he's still around, although he's not active anymore, or up to Brooklyn, Kathy Burns' place, or out to Wichita for Bob Olson's annual con. And
was that Pudge Con? I remember that.
Con. Yeah, I was trying to remember the name of Pudge Con was the name of it. And Mike Mazer was a great friend of Bob Olson's, and Bob, Mike Mazer used to, they would play in games together, and Mike always stabbed him, and Bob never saw it coming.
The early days of Postal included people like Gary Gygax and Jerry Pornell. Gary Gygax, who invented Dungeons and Dragons, and Jerry Pornell ended up being a professional science fiction writer.
Mm-hmm.
There were people like that involved in the early days. We do have an interesting but different hobby now, but it's still got diplomacy players in it. Is there something about players of diplomacy, you think, that makes the structures of the fandom which grow up around the game sort of dynamic and entertaining, just based upon the people who play the game?
I think so. Again, as I said before, I'm not really deep in the hobby these days, although I might try to do more. Since I retired, I got back in touch with a lot of people. Toward the end of my career, I just basically dropped out of it altogether.
Well, it's only been a few years since you've been at DixieCon. We'd be glad to have you back this time or next year.
Oh, yeah,
hadn't been that long.
Yeah, but diplomacy players, it's an interesting type of person. They're very social. Obviously, it's the game. Is all about social interaction between the players. It's less about what's going on the board and much more about what the dynamic among the players who are playing the game. They tend to be articulate. They tend to be smart. They tend to be quite opinionated, and they're glad to share their opinion. Although they'll hold back their opinions if it's going to get them ahead in the game. And they tend to be, again, accomplished and good writers, and I'm not, and people through all walks of life, but who have these kind of personal characteristics, and it's the thing that I always found most attractive to the game, even more so than the game itself. It's the people who are playing the game.
Oh yeah, well, I think that's true for today's hobby as well.
Mm-hmm.
Give us your final thoughts, if you would, Ken, for today's hobbyists. If you could recreate some aspect of the hobby landscape that you sort of grew up in that you think would be particularly cool or beneficial now, what would that be? What would you recreate that you think would be important?
Well, again, the face-to-face world and the tournament world, I think, is very strong. DixieCon is was one of the best. But from what I read on the people I'm in contact with on Facebook and such, of course the coronavirus threw everything in a mess. But there's a very active face-to-face group, and there's some extremely accomplished players. You're one of them, frankly. Again, and that part of the hobby, I think, is quite strong, and that can continue to be built on. But I think what's lost a little bit is this is aspects of the postal world, and I don't know exactly how to create it. I understand, that there are websites that run games, so there are people from all over the world, and so you would think that would kind of replace the world of postal diplomacy, but a lot of them, I think, as I understand it, are anonymous. You play players play as anonymous people, and you know, I just don't know that it gives. So in their own little world, I think, again, I don't know, because I've never played on any of those sites. I know Chris Martin was talking about one that he's active with, and maybe I should go and try to check it out.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, because there are games
Mhm,
you play with people that you do know who they are and where they are and all that. It's a little bit of
mhm,
a mixed bag, and you probably don't know this, but in the last couple of years since COVID shut down the face-to-face world, we now have virtual face-to-face tournaments, and so
mm,
people play live online with audio feed. It's really cool, but
mm.
things, but you're right that the
But you
sort
don't,
of
you can't get the kind of personal interaction you get at a real tournament,
no.
because the person who's right in front of you and talking, you're looking in their eyes, and then later afterwards meeting with them over a beer or something and talking over the game and
Oh, yeah.
getting to know people, and it's just it's a substitute, but not the ideal substitute.
Agreed. So what that means, ladies and gentlemen, out there in diplomacy land, is that Ken Peel is saying you should go to
Go to DixieCon.
DipCon, or the DipCon coming up in California in
Oh,
April, or DixieCon in May, or the World
mhm.
DipCon in Vermont in November. Any of these events, and all of them are great. Ken, thanks for being on Diplomacy Broadcast Network. It is great to connect with you after
Yeah,
several years, and look forward to maybe getting you back involved some
yeah,
now that you're
sure.
retired.
Okay. Thanks, David.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
And now for this episode's panel discussion. The diplomacy hobby has always had what we call nowadays content creators, with zine publishers and writers producing strategy and tactics articles, tournament reviews, etc., beginning in the 1960s. With modern technology, of course, content creation has become a much more sophisticated, much more accessible, and much more fun for everyone involved. Why do diplomacy content creators do what they do, and how important are they to the hobby as a whole? Let's discuss this topic with three current creators themselves. Californian Marcus Edholm from Diplostrats, Douglas Rintoul, aka Florida Man, coming to us from Pennsylvania, and Kevin O'Kelly in Chicago, representing the Diplomacy Broadcast Network. Well, Marcus, let me start with you. Tell us a little bit about how you got into the game, and also how you got into the Diplostrats YouTube channel.
So I got into diplomacy the same way I got into board gaming as a hobby in general, which was my mother introduced me. She played board games growing up. She played diplomacy with her friends on Friday nights back when she was in high school, and she taught me how to play. But for her, it was just another game, and for me, it was very much more than that. And that's how I got into it. I got into Diplostrats by Captain Meme. He was looking for someone to commentate a game with him, and he just kept going down the list, and then he kept going down the list and the list and the list, and then he really scraped the bottom of the barrel when he asked me, "Hey, Marcus, by any chance, do you want to commentate a game with me?" And I was like, "All right, absolutely, sure." And so with that, we filmed the first one, and we just kept finding more games that we wanted to talk about and commentate, and that's how the channel kept going.
And the rest is history.
I mean, for those of us who care about this particular part of history, but yes.
And all of us do. That's why we're here. So, Douglas, let me go to you. What possessed you to start the Florida Man channel on YouTube?
You know, back when I started it, my channel name, I don't even think it was Florida Man Diplomacy, because that wasn't even my username in diplomacy back then. It's so long ago. But to some extent, it was hubris. Starting a YouTube channel seemed like an easy enough thing. I was playing so many games of diplomacy online, and I was interested in sharing my love of the hobby with other people. And so first I found an in-person group to play with. Then I started posting a lot on the playdiplomacy.com forum. And finally, I said, you know what? Why don't I start making videos? I basically couldn't get enough. I was fortunate that I just drastically underestimated at that time how much time making videos would take. But or I wouldn't have gotten started probably. But once I did, it became kind of self-perpetuating as a labor of love.
And how did you get into the hobby? I don't know if I asked you that before, the last time you were on the show.
I'm not sure you did. Well, I remember I played with some friends in high school, and then just started looking online, found playdiplomacy.com, and discovered that I was pretty good at it. And so that kind of led me to get really obsessed for a while.
So, Kevin, did you find that you were really good at it? Is that how you got involved in diplomacy, or exactly what? And then tell us how you got roped into DBN by your fellow Windy City Weasels.
Yeah, I got roped into it through college. We were a group of friends, Friday night, same way. It was, well, what are we going to do? And so we played the game, and we usually made about 3, maybe 4 years before a few too many beverages had been consumed, and the game got into just chaos. But I enjoyed the game. The guy who introduced me said, "Hey, you're after graduation, there's these Yahoo groups where people will play by email." And so kind of like the previous two guys said, you just kind of fell in love. I think I was in like 8 full press games at a time and trying to balance my first job. It was chaos. And then I was GMing, and it was fun. Then Jim O'Kelly, no relation, founder of the Windy City Weasels here in Chicago, emailed me on the group and said, "Hey, we've got people who play in person. Have you ever done that?" And I said, "Yeah." I told him the college story, and he goes, "Well, we're having a game. Why don't you come up?" I was 3 hours from Chicago at the time. So I drove up one weekend and met a great group of people, fell in love with the game, and have been with the Weasels for 16 years ever since. Getting involved with DBN was almost an accident. Fellow Weasels, Brandon Fogel and Brian Pravel, along with kind of a Weasel, Zachary Moore, who did win our Chicago tournament in 2019. So a group of Weasels. Brandon had sent a message. He goes, "You got a gift of gab. You want to join us one night?" And so I had seen the stream. I was not involved at the start of the pandemic. I was late to the party. But as I've learned, better to have been late than not join at all. So glad I was asked, and just happened to fall into it, and I'm here every weekend doing it, and I love it.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, Kevin. What roles do you play at DBN, and how did how has that progressed over time?
It definitely progressed a lot. As DBN, the beauty of it is there are just so many things you can do, and we're always looking for people to join in the different roles. I mentioned Brandon said, "Hey, come on and be an analyst." I don't like that's my least favorite thing on DBN. It's not my thing. I transitioned into a sideline reporter one time, and I think that is the most fun, but definitely draining. So you get to be in the room with the best players in the world, learning their secrets and how they do things, and maybe even improve your play while helping it out. I've been a host, which I think is the most difficult job in all of DBN. You are live most of the time. There are 100 buttons to push. You're switching screens, you're switching orders, you're switching people on the broadcast. Oh, and your internet can go out, and you're worrying. But at the end of the day, the host has to be there to get that stuff done, and we're glad we have a few doing that. And then what I think is most rewarding in my current role is kind of a creator and producer. A lot of behind the scenes that I like not being on screen, but without that producer, you don't have as many new items coming on. So I love all the roles, and I'm always looking at new things, and the group we have is fantastic. So we're always trying to make a good show.
That is certainly our goal. Yes. Marcus, let's talk about Diplostrat's just a minute. My perception is that you're basically the color commentator, with Captain Meme as more of the play-by-play analyst. Do you see your role that way? And also, do you see your role in the hobby as helping promote better play as a commentator?
Helping promote better play is a strong statement that might imply some belief in my own level of play, as if I can actually tell most of anybody else who watches my videos how to play diplomacy better. What I do is I try to improve my own play. I try to look at these games and analyze them, and I try to see, if I was in this position, what would I do? how would I play? With each given moveset, I look at what do I expect any other country to do? What are they going to make? And I figure if I can predict well enough on these commentaries, maybe I'll be able to predict how people will play in my own games. And that's, I think, the most important thing. If you told me what everyone was going to do every turn of diplomacy, I'd win every game. So I try to get closer to that level. And if that makes other people play better, then that's great. I'm happy to do so. But I don't try to think of myself as teaching people or berating bad players, although I know I definitely berate players for making moves that I think are mistakes. And I'm trying not to do that, but we all fail.
Yeah, I've seen you do that a couple of times, but I've also seen you, talk about moves that help people learn to play better. And that's one of the goals I think we all have on our content creation, is just trying to spread the word and also improve the hobby. Douglas, I see you doing that on the Florida Man channel. You often have what I would call after action reports from certain online games that have been played, whether you've been in them or not. Do you think that content is important to helping people, learn to play the game better?
I do, and thank you for asking. It's something I really enjoy doing. In part, one of the big reasons why I do Florida Man Diplomacy is because I want to entertain people and want to entertain myself. And I think showing that gaming aspect of showing the game as it's played, sort of the way the players are thinking about it, or at least the way at least one player is thinking about it, either me or the person I'm interviewing or the person who wrote down their thoughts for me, I think that makes it more interesting, more personal. I've really, some of the most rewarding moments of doing this have been when people have commented and said, I don't really know anything about diplomacy, but I'm kind of interested now. Or, you got me into diplomacy. That really makes my day.
Yeah, that is one of the better parts of this activity, is when people tell you how much they've, enjoyed and then got involved in the hobby because of what you did. Douglas, have you had any, what I would call setbacks in doing this, either technical issues or production issues or content issues, anything that stands out to you as being sort of an issue? There may be people watching this who want to jump into this content creation themselves. So let's give them a few ideas of what they might expect.
Well, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but the big challenge for me has always been time. It's really time consuming to make diplomacy content. I think it would be a little less time consuming if I just wrote a blog instead of making videos, because that would probably cut the time expended at least in half, maybe more, because I write scripts, I record videos, and then I edit the recordings, which takes at least as much time as the video, and usually much more. My channel was on hiatus for over a year at one point because I was just so busy with life stuff. And it's been kind of lucky for me that I've been able to find a way to make this a regular thing in my life. But for instance, I have a series of videos about a game called Talleyrand that's about as long as a season of television. And it's all interviews with players. So I had to coordinate, and every week I would talk to all 7 of the players in this game. I would interview them, I would record those interviews, and then later I would edit them. And only after the game was over did I release all of these interviews. And so this was obviously a huge investment of time that was difficult to arrange. It could only happen really because I scheduled a lot of my stuff around it, and because I think at the time the pandemic allowed for a lot of remote work, and so I was basically juggling this with my job. But other people will probably not want to expend quite as much time as I did on that, and I think that would be not sustainable for me to do again at present.
Well, I should have started with this. I'm going to get each of you to tell me this, but tell us what your job is. People want to know who the people are. that they're watching on the screen. So who are you, Douglas Rentoul, when you're during your workday?
Well, at present, I'm a prosecutor. I'm an assistant district attorney. Soon, though, I will be going to private practice. But overall, I am an attorney, obviously.
Yes, you're a courtroom lawyer. Kevin, you are not a courtroom lawyer, but you do have a career. So tell us about that, and then explain to us how easy it was for you to pick up everything that you do at DBN. It was a complete cakewalk for you, I'm sure.
My day job is I work with park districts, municipalities, school districts to help them do their capital planning and capital finance. Keeps me busy. A lot of pre-pandemic, a lot of nighttime meetings because that's when your local governments meet. So the pandemic, like Douglas, you must have stolen my answer to this one because mine will be very similar. But the time the pandemic has created has allowed for some of this creativity, and it's definitely not a cakewalk because David, as you know, once you think any game of diplomacy is a cakewalk, you better be watching out because you're going to be getting attacked from 3 different sides and you won't know what hit you. I've always wanted to be the broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs. I love baseball. I love sports. And I always, when I got more into this, I always felt like this is, my chance to do something which probably career-wise never would have worked out, but it's been a nice fit. A lot of the team behind the scenes have similar, kind of backgrounds. We pick up things from things we've seen on TV in the past, and we learn from it. And we've done new things. We've tried new items, new ideas, trying to create new content for the reasons, like you say, better play, better community. But all of that takes time, and that's the hardest part is running these programs and live streams. You're planning well in advance, and you need a good team. You have to manage your own schedule, work-wise, family-wise, and that's the most challenging thing. Personally, for me, absolutely, and I think a lot of the team as well. We realize what we can provide, for this, but we have to manage ourselves in order to make it work.
Yeah, that's totally right. Marcus, speaking of time, some of the Diplostrats content is really, really long because you're looking at long games and you're, going very deep into those games. Do you find those types of broadcasts particularly difficult for you as a commentator to sort of go on that long?
Yes. We intentionally try to create long videos. We're aware that a lot of our viewers fall asleep while watching our content. And so in an effort to help them with that, we know some people take a while to fall asleep. And so we might as well drag these things out as long as possible, give them as much of an opportunity to make that happen. So we do intentionally try to go long. Occasionally we have to meet time deadlines because we have things in real life that we have to get to. And it's pretty obvious when that happens because we start going. We also try to be as thorough as possible in our analysis of games. We really try to examine every possibility. Whenever we see a place where a country could make a game-changing maneuver, we really try to point out, hey, this is a really subtle move where if the English Channel goes to the Mid-Atlantic Ocean here, it's a radically different ballgame. Or, oh my God, this retreat with Ukraine, it could have gone off the board, and it's a whole other world. And part of why we love diplomacy is how many opportunities there are for that. Now, most games, these opportunities go missed. They would just fly right on by because this game, it was a juggernaut. Turkey and Russia were working together. They were crushing. Why would anyone do anything different? And good question, why? Frequently, it's not a good idea to do so, but oftentimes, maybe it is. And it's certainly an interesting question. And if you go into every game saying, what's a move that could change this game? And you ask that question about every single move for every single unit, your videos would take a long time also.
I'm sorry, Marcus, I dozed off during some of that. Could you repeat? Wait, that's what you were going for, wasn't it? You were trying to put me to sleep. It worked. Actually, I forgot to ask you what's your career when you're not doing Diplo strats, if there are any minutes in the day in which you're not involved in Diplo strats?
There are many. For my day job, I'm working as a subcontractor for Google. I'm working in IT. Sometimes engineers need equipment to test their things on. They need them set up to very specific standards, and I get everything set up for the engineers so they can do their very important work, like stealing your data.
Groovy. That sounds great. All right. So, to be serious, actually, you don't have to be, but I do want you to answer the following question, Kevin O'Kelly. Your final thoughts for our audience about diplomacy content creation, the wonderful world of diplomacy content creation. So, go.
It's a lot different than when I first started out, but it all kind of ties back. I think the game of diplomacy makes great stories. We know that because, we certainly remember our first game, our first solo, if you're lucky enough, your first championship. But stories around diplomacy also include going to weddings and celebrating with friends, traveling the world to go to face-to-face cons. Those are all things in which helps build the story of community. I think that's a big part of DBN. It sprung up from the pandemic. We missed each other, and so the founder's great idea to put this together is great. And so we're always looking for new people to join to help us spread the message, to come up with new ideas. Content is unlimited. If you've got an idea and you want to tell your story, it's certainly here. We're doing, we think, a good job with it, but a lot of what we've learned has been feedback. So the group is what makes us go, and I look forward to many projects that we have yet to tackle.
So, storytelling and community from Kevin O'Kelly. Marcus at home, what's your message for our audience about diplomacy content creation?
I love mass marketing. I think if diplomacy became a more popular game, everyone here would be incredibly happy with it. So whatever we can do to get more people into the hobby, the better. And I think this is a great way to do it.
All right, over to you, Florida Man, for the final word. I want you to tell us what we need to know about the wisdom of diplomacy that you have for us before you say your normal trademark Florida Man out. So go.
Well, for anyone who's considering becoming a diplomacy content creator, it is a labor of love, and at first it's a labor you will engage in by yourself, but then as time goes by, you get this sense of community that's not dependent on geography at all at this point, and you'll have regular people who you see all the time in your comments, or who play in games with you frequently, or who will volunteer to help you in some way with your videos or your blog posts or whatever you're doing. And the more you invest in it, the more rewarding it is, I think. So that's all I want.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was just saying that's all I've got.
All right. Well, good. Because what I was going to say is, on behalf of the hobby as a whole, I want to thank the three of you for what you do to help build community and relationships and the fabric of our hobby. The games are one thing, but the diplomacy hobby is made up of people like you who are giving back to the community by helping people understand the game, play the game better, make connections with each other. And so for all of those reasons, thank you, and thank you. And also thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, David.
And thanks to all of you watching at home. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast of Deadline. If you have news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send us an email at info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly using davidhood@dixiecon.com. For our other broadcast offerings, visit our website at diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.